Hey everybody, welcome to West Seattle Christian Church Online. My name is Worth. If you're new, welcome. Thanks for joining us. If not, welcome back. And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe as well as hit the like icon below. This will really help the channel out. Today, before we start, I want to bring up something that we haven't talked about in quite some time, and that's giving. So for some of you watching out there, maybe on YouTube or on our website, did you know that the work we do, the ministry we do, that God has given us to do here in West Seattle is done through the generosity of those who call West Seattle Christian Church their church home? And so for the last couple of years, we've been increasing the amount of funding that we give away from the gifts that are given to us. A percentage of that we give away, and we invest it in missions and in nonprofit work around the world and here at home. And through the generosity of people like you, all the funds that come into our church, we've increased that. So in 2016, the amount that we gave outside these walls was 11%, and we've steadily increased that until we're giving 16% today, which really means that your generosity matters, and it matters to the initiatives that we've partnered with. Things like Bread of Life Mission, West Seattle Food Bank, White Center Food Bank. There's 2 church plants here in Seattle that we fund, missionaries in Russia and Ethiopia and Laos doing gospel work. One of those missionary families started a coffee business that employs just dozens of people and has seen all kinds of people come to Christ. Another has trained dozens of indigenous evangelists and pastors and planted dozens of churches, who have started dozens more, all alongside starting several medical clinics and sinking dozens of water wells. On top of that all, and the 16% we've utilized towards kingdom initiatives, last year, in the midst of the pandemic, we were able to help local businesses right here in West Seattle by buying $30,000 in gift cards and then gifting those gift cards to the West Seattle Food Bank for their Instruments of Change auction. And then God multiplied that through the food bank's efforts into over $100,000 they raised to help those in our community who are most in need. So we encourage you to give and to give generously, to spread the love of Christ in physical and tangible ways right here and around the world. And if you haven't ever given part of your finances to God before, we encourage you to give it a try. Go ahead and do it. If you have already done so, but you're in the position to increase that giving, we also encourage you to be even more generous. All of that just to say, your generosity really matters. All right, onward. Today, we're going to look at one of the strangest Bible passages that you've probably never read or you forgot about. And the setup is this. Jacob has 2 wives, Rachel, who he loves, and Leah, who he does not love. So he had 2 wives, and he had 2 handmaidens, and Leah is having kids like crazy, and Rachel can't have babies. So there's this tension. And Rachel's getting really jealous. But finally, she has a son, Jacob, names him Joseph. And Joseph is special to Jacob because he is the oldest boy of the wife that he loves. But there's a problem. He's not the oldest boy in their family, the Behor. The role of the Behor, the firstborn, is responsibility for the family legacy. Who's the one that's going to take over the legacy of their family? Is it Reuben or is it Joseph? And Jacob tries to make Joseph the one who's responsible for the legacy, which makes Reuben and all the other boys just a little bit ticked off. Why? Because Reuben is the real firstborn. So Joseph, he receives this coat of many colors from Jacob, and this coat marks him out as the Behor. Then, to make it worse, when Joseph is 17 years old, he has a dream. And in this dream, his brothers are bundles of wheat, and they bow down to him. So he's already on the outs with his brothers because of what his dad has done. And he tells them this dream, you were bowing down to me. And then he has another dream where not only his brothers are bowing down, but his mom and dad are too. So he decides it's good to share this, and he shares it with the whole family. And his dad, Jacob, is like, hey kid, it's one thing to tell your brothers that, but not me. So that's the setup. And in the very next story, Jacob sends Joseph out into the fields to be with his brothers. And this is where it all goes south. But remember, who sends him out? His dad does, Jacob. And this matters because from Joseph's perspective then, one way of thinking about it, as far as Joseph knows, his dad is in on what's about to happen next. Because the last thing he told his dad was that he and his mom would bow down to him too. So if you've been in church for a while, maybe you've never heard it put that way before, but I think that backdrop is important to have the proper understanding of what we're going to be talking about this week and next. So, Genesis 37, halfway through verse 17, let's pick it up there. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him, throw him into one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. And then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. And that's kind of cool because even though there's this tension between Reuben and Joseph about who the real firstborn is, Reuben is actually acting in line with what would be required for their family values. He's acting responsible for the legacy here, even though his dad, Jacob, has kind of undermined Reuben. So let's read on. Reuben says, "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So Reuben had his own plan here. Throw him into the cistern, and when everyone else is gone, I'm going to come and rescue him, yay, and bring him home. And don't miss the fact that if this were to happen, and if it would have worked out this way, Reuben would have looked really good in that light, right? All right, moving on. Verse 23. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him in the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Okay, so it's interesting, if you're paying attention, that the text goes back and forth between who they're selling him to, Ishmaelites or Midianites, and there's a lot of commentary on this and attempts to resolve it. I happen to think that ultimately it's really not that big of a deal. However, I also think it's not so much about who they sold him to, but what they sold him for. And that's just kind of a side note, a little rabbit trail for you to chew on this week. You can study that on your own a little bit and see what you think. So, verse 29, when Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. Actually, it wasn't like that. Cloth was too valuable back then. The common practice was just to rip about an inch of your garment by the neck to show that you were in mourning. So, verse 30, he went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. So let's stop here for a minute and go back and remember who exactly is responsible for selling Joseph. And what I mean by that is, who came up with the plan? It wasn't Reuben. Judah came up with the plan in verse 26. So just tuck that in your pocket for later because I think it's going to be important. Verse 32, they took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." So in the Hebrew, this is really an interesting phrase. This literally says, they brought the robe back to Jacob and said, "Do you recognize this?" They don't exactly lie, and they don't exactly tell him what happened either. So Jacob is left to draw his own conclusion about what might have happened. And when they do this, this is what they are doing when they do this. They are objectifying Joseph to use him for their own ends. They used him. They dehumanized him. They made him an object to get what they wanted. And in a few more verses, we read that Joseph is sold into Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Okay, so that's the story. That's how it starts. And let's set the stage a little bit more for this drama. What's happening here is Joseph's brothers don't like him. And in order to justify their anger, they dehumanize him. They make him an object so they can sell him. And this is an important reality for us to recognize in our own selves, in our own lives right now. When you're angry at someone, we look for ways to rationalize and justify why it's okay to be angry and to continue to be angry with other people. And what we most often do in order to do that, in order to keep that up, we dehumanize others. We dehumanize them because if this were a real person with real feelings and a real story and a real background and a real family and real things happening to them with a real understanding of the world, it's really hard for me not to engage in conversation towards resolution, towards forgiveness and peace if they're a real human being. But in our hearts and minds, when we distill them down to an object or a problem or an issue, it's really easy to disassociate them from being a human being. So you can just kind of remove them from the equation and shove them to the side or ghost them or whatever. So they have objectified Joseph in the extreme. And the question is, can God's people ever get away with dehumanizing others? Nope. And this is really the antithesis of what it means to live in God's kingdom. And so we have to figure out how to solve that in this story and in our stories. Now, he gets sold into Egypt to be a servant in Potiphar's house. So we would expect the next story to be about Joseph in Potiphar's house, right? But it's not. There is this really bizarre, messed up story in between Joseph being sold and then what happens later in Potiphar's house. And seriously, there are no moral giants in this next section. And you've probably never heard it preached on. And it's definitely let out of the kids' church curriculum. Like, there's no coloring page for this for them to do. It's one of those things where you go, how could God even have anything to do with these people? Why is he even trying to use these people? Because it's a total mess. And this is in the Bible. So it's the things that are said in here, don't get mad at me. It's what's in there. So in Genesis 38, and you can read this on your own, we read about Judah finding a wife and having kids. So these are Jacob's grandkids. There are 3 of them, Onan, and Shelah. And then the text fast forwards quite a few years in the space of just a few verses, and the 2 oldest boys are old enough to be married. And marries Tamar. And we don't know what does, but apparently he's so wicked that the Lord puts him to death, and there are no details given. And then in verse 8, even though to our modern sensibilities this is weird and kind of gross, Judah tells the second son, Onan, to take Tamar as his wife and have kids with her. And this would have been customary to the culture back then. But then you get to verse 9, and it gets even more dicey. And frankly, this is one of those moments where when I encounter Christians who think reading secular works of literature are evil, like Harry Potter or something, or watching those movies, I'm like, have you even read the Bible? Do you know what's in this thing? Come on, get a little perspective. So Onan, the text says, sleeps with his wife, Tamar, and the text spells out graphically that he has no intention of getting her pregnant. And when we read this, we're like, that's gross. And our attention is on one aspect of this or another. For instance, in some parts of the religious world, the whole conversation about contraception, about whether you should use birth control or not, is relegated to this verse and this verse alone. And that is the last thing this verse is about. It's not about that at all. It is about something much, much deeper. The real wickedness here is this. It's about objectifying. If he's not going to have children with her, and he knows it, then why is he sleeping with her to begin with? I'll tell you why, and you already know the answer too. Let's just put it as simply as possible. He is using her. For his own ends, he is using her. And guess what she gets to say about it? Nothing. Verse 10 says, what he did was wicked in the Lord's sight. Duh. So the Lord put him to death also. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, he may die too, just like his brother. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. So here, Judah's thinking, she's bad luck. To protect my last son, I'm going to send her away. Both of my other sons were married to her, and now they're dead. Well, this is just messed up. Judah doesn't even seem to stop and think, how do I care for her? She's married 2 of my boys. She's my daughter-in-law. How do I provide for her and protect her? There's nothing like that in the text. He's basically like, get out. And why is he able to do that? What is he doing here? She's already been dehumanized by Onan. We can infer that it wasn't that great with either. And now what does Judah do? He has dehumanized her as well. She's an object to him. She's an issue that needs a remedy. She's a problem to solve. To him, she is inhuman. And the question is, how are God's people ever going to be known as those who restore humanity to those who've had it taken away from them? So in verse 12 and following, we find that a long time has passed since his first 2 sons have died. And remember, he said that he would eventually give Tamar to his 3rd son, Shelah, when he grows up. Well, He's grown up now, but Judah has not made this happen. He is not honoring his word. And just when you thought it was already bad enough, it gets worse and worse in verse 13. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." Like, really? Yeah, this story is not good. And it's worse than you really think, because she's not just a prostitute. She's a shrine prostitute in Judah's mind, which means she's a temple prostitute to a pagan god. What the heck, Judah? What are you doing? He knows this. So the conversation happens. "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. And he said, "What pledge should I give you?" "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand," she answered. So let's stop there for a second. This seal would sometimes be on a ring and sometimes on a thing that you'd wear on your waistband at your hip that's attached to a cord. And they had these to use as signets or signatures because most people in this culture didn't know how to write. And they would, do a legal document and press the seal into wax, kind of like you imagine in the Middle Ages. And the seal was the symbol of your family's honor and your prestige. And if you lose this, your whole family would be shamed. And he just gives it to her. He gives it up. Well, the summary of the next part is that they both go back to business as usual. And Judah sends his friend to give her the goat that he promised her, but then the friend can't find her. And in fact, when they ask around, the people who live there are like, "What are you talking about? There's not a shrine prostitute here. There hasn't been one for ages." And Judah is basically, when he hears this, he's basically like, "Hey, I upheld my part of the deal, the transaction. But if she's not there to accept the payment, it's not my fault. Whoop-de-doo. I don't care." And once again, he's leveraging the situation to protect himself. If there was ever a situation of self-deception, this is it. And again, objectifying. Now jump to verse 24, however, and the story kind of shifts into high gear. The people where Tamar lives, they discover that she is pregnant. And they know that she belongs to Judah's household, so they come and they tell him. And what does Judah say? Judah says, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." Why? Because she's guilty of prostitution. We won't talk about what he did. That's not part of the conversation, but she's guilty. Which sounds a bit like a bit of the scenario Jesus runs into in John chapter 8, where he's writing in the dirt in front of the men who want to condemn the woman caught in adultery. But where the heck is the man caught in adultery? So Tamar's guilty, and she made the family look bad, and so Judah has to save face and keep the family honor. So how does he do that? Well, she's got to pay. Because if you're going to do the wrong thing, then you should do it in a way that you don't get caught. Because somehow that makes it better, right? No. And so once again, Judah objectifies and dehumanizes Tamar to use her to protect his own reputation. And then we get to verse 25, which says this. "And she was being brought out. She sent a message to her father-in-law, 'I'm pregnant by the man who owns these.' And she said, and she added, 'See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are.'" Seriously, literally, in the Hebrew, she says, "Do you recognize this?" The same phrase Judah used to try to convince his dad that Joseph was no longer in the picture when he held up the coat. How do you like them apples? And all of a sudden, Judah gets it. It's like a lightning bolt goes off in his brain. It's this massive shift for his whole life. Look at verse 26. "Judah recognized them and said, 'She's more righteous than I. Duh, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah, and he did not sleep with her again.'" So all of a sudden, Judah's whole world is topsy-turvy. It's upended. He's like, wait a minute. I've been doing this all wrong. I've been trying to protect myself and work my angles, and it's not working. The problem is there's a whole lot of people who are paying the price for that, for my selfishness, for my own ego, for my own reputation. There is a lot of people paying the price for me to continually try to look good. And here's the deal. That is always true. If your primary objective in your life is to make sure that you look good, then the people around you will pay a price in order for that to happen, and they always will. And so just like Judah, the question we have to wrestle with is, do we value people enough to let ourselves look bad? Or do we place them in the object category, the dehumanized category, so that we can protect our own reputation? How do we reconcile this? Well, there's something a little redemptive about how Judah responds to this that I actually like, because publicly he says, we're going to burn her at the stake. But she confessed to him in private. So he has a choice to make. There isn't this moment where she outs him on national TV news. She just sends the seal back to him along with a message privately through a messenger, if you read the text. And Judah, at this point, he could just ignore it. He could just be like, oh, I'm going to cover this up, let her burn. And given what we've seen him do so far, not only with Tamar, but also with Joseph, we've kind of been conditioned to expect him to not do the right thing here. To let her die would have been more consistent with what he's done so far. I mean, he pretended that his own brother was dead, if you remember. That's not what he does. And I think it's this phrase that changes him in the text. Do you recognize this? And that throws him back to what he said to his dad about his brother Joseph's coat. And he's like, oh my gosh, I've been living this way my whole life and it's not working and it hasn't gone well for the people around me. And my dad still breaks down crying because of Joseph, even years later. And he's like, I got to do something different. So, spoiler alert here, when Joseph is finally reunited with his brothers, Judah is the one who changes the outcome of how Joseph is responding to him and his brothers. So, see, if you read that story, if you know the story, the problem is, if you've read the story of Joseph being reunited with his brothers, is that you already know the outcome, that it's kind of like happily ever after. But if you read the story for the first time and you don't know where it's headed, you look at Joseph and it does not look like he intends to resolve anything with his brothers. But then Judah in the story steps close to Joseph and he's vulnerable and he's transparent. He says, look, my dad has already lost one son. He's talking about Joseph. And it has destroyed him from that day until now. He cannot lose another one. It will probably kill him. And it's at that point Joseph probably realizes, oh my gosh, my dad wasn't in on it. And it changes everything. So I want you to see when Judah stops trying to protect himself, it changes everything. When he stops objectifying other people and he gets real and transparent and vulnerable about his own mistakes, all of a sudden, the whole world opens up to the family being reconciled. Maybe for those of us who are sitting in broken families or who have experienced relationships that have been torn apart, maybe part of the key is that we're willing to look bad so that the truth can finally get on the table. There are so many people that try to live a lie, and the reality is that you can't fix a lie, and they're trying to understand why living a facade is not working. And I'll tell you why, because it's a lie. That's why it's not working. So you got to stop trying to leverage other people to protect your own reputation, and then you need to live in the truth, because Jesus says that it's the truth that will set you free. Nothing else will. Listen, in this story we've worked through today, and I've read it a few times, I mean, there's a new layer of moral bankruptcy at each turn. It is a mess. But these characters, Judah, Tamar, Perez, if you keep reading, they're in the lineage of Jesus. In other words, no Tamar, no Jesus. And that gives me hope, because if God can redeem a jacked up story like this, then that gives me hope. He can redeem my story, and he can redeem your story too. It all begins when we stop objectifying other people, using them for our own gain, and we start telling the truth about who we are and where we're at in life. And the way we do that is through confession. Confession is a powerful spiritual discipline. It is transformative to verbalize the truth of the mess, that not only am I in it, but I've created this mess. And when we stop with the crazy and hiding behind our masks and get to the point where we say, you know what, I blew it. That is the foundation of change. That is the foundation of freedom in your life. We talked about this earlier, and one of the things we tend to do as people is we want to justify why it's okay for us to be hurt and angry with others. They wronged me and I have the right to be offended. We sit on a hilltop like Jonah, waiting for these people to be destroyed. At the end of that story of Jonah, Jonah's sitting there and God is like, do you have the right to be angry, to be mad at me? And Jonah's like, yeah, heck yeah, I do. And we often find ourselves in that position of wanting to have the right to be justified in our anger. And the way we enable ourselves to do that is we blame other people for why we're mad. But here's the cold, hard truth. No one is responsible for how you feel except for you. No one else is responsible for how you feel. And I know you're saying, but they did. Yeah. She said, yep. He acted like, yeah. And you're the only one who has the power to do anything about it in your life. Nobody else is responsible for that, only you. And you have a choice. It's not an easy choice for sure, but you have a choice to begin the process of living the truth and living in the truth. Don't hear me wrong. It is definitely okay to be hurt. It's okay to be angry and mad. It is okay because people do objectify us. But if we don't get real about how to deal with it, we will just perpetuate it because we'll only return the favor on other people and we'll never be able to be free. You can never move forward and heal and become something better if you continue to put on a mask about who you really are. Because I gotta justify why it's okay for me to keep you out here. I mean, here's what we do. When we offend somebody, we have these tendencies that we go through. And the first one is to deny it and then to minimize it. Like, once I can't deny it, once I can't say that didn't happen anymore, and I try to minimize it, we were like, oh, hey, it really wasn't that big of a deal. And then when we can't minimize it anymore, then we get mad about it. So with that, we can try to regain control because we got to keep up the facade. We got to keep the mask on, the show, right? So we deny it and then we minimize it and then we get mad about it. So I want you to recognize those things. And when you get real and confess what you did and you don't try to deny and minimize or get mad, then it helps you heal. But it also helps the other person or persons heal too. And you have to know that. Because when we make our own mistakes, it's not just me that gets healed. There's a ripple effect through the community of relationships that are all linked. And healing begins. And it's critical. So I want to end with that today. Stop carrying around the burden of having to have it all together. You were never meant to have it all figured out. You were meant to be part of a community that would see you through the difficult times. So here's just a couple of questions when we think about confession. Is there something that you need to confess out loud to someone, to your family, to your kids, to your spouse, to your parents, your friends, your coworkers, your neighbors? Do you need the courage to move past something that someone else has done to you? Maybe it's something that you've never said out loud. For example, I was fill in the blank. Whatever it is, maybe you've never told anybody, and maybe it's time to confess that. Not to make you look like you don't have it all together, but to set you free. So before you partake of communion today, take a minute to talk with the Lord about that. If you need to get in touch with me or would like to talk to a leader here at the church, just jump on our website and get a hold of us. We'll connect with you. And lastly, if there's something you need to confess to somebody, be brave and then go do that. Until next time, I'm Worth Wheeler for West Seattle Christian Church Online. Stay rooted and deep in Jesus and produce good fruit, my friends.